I was thinking to myself, 5-MeO, what? I mean, like, never heard of it, right? The main point was that they were just all over the top of what it had done for them. They had tried everything up to this point, and nothing worked. So that was my introduction.
When we found that data, I did some comparisons with other studies that used the same pain paradigm. What I noticed, if you compare the outcomes of the analgesic effect, it's actually comparable to some of the classic opioids that are currently being used to treat pain.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hello, I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. As a journalist, I've been covering psychedelics since about 2015, also known as the before times. Back then, it was pretty easy reporting on this beat. I remember when there was just a few weekly news items, a study here or there, some policy changes, but that was about it. These days, it's a full-time job trying to keep up with all the psychedelics news. Last year, in 2020, I had to make a choice. Stop reading COVID-19 news all the time, or stop reading drug news all the time. I didn't have the capacity for both, and I chose to follow drugs. One recent tally I heard was that there are now more than 300 startups trying to develop entheogenic substances or related drugs into valuable pharmaceuticals. It's why I've been saying for a while now that it's less of a psychedelic renaissance and more of a psychedelic gold rush. Psychedelics probably really are these promising substances that can ease a lot of suffering and bring healing to people who have run out of options. I say probably because while the data on psychedelics is pretty strong, there still needs to be a lot of room for skepticism. After all, these drugs aren't for everyone, and they can't treat everything. And these days, there isn't an ailment some Silicon Valley-esque startup is trying to treat with psychedelics. Of course, you have depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD, and fear of death for the terminally ill. There's some good data on treating all of that, but some of the more obscure treatments include anorexia and eating disorders, sexual dysfunction, dementia, and even rare conditions like Fragile X syndrome. Psychedelics are amazing drugs. They've definitely brought me a lot of personal growth and reframing of trauma, but come on, they're not a panacea. I'm not saying this research isn't worth investigating, but how do you determine what's just hype and what the actual potential of psilocybin, LSD, DMT, etc. is? So I was pretty skeptical when I first heard of psychedelics being used to treat physical pain. Yet while the research is very young, there is some fascinating evidence that psychedelics may help with chronic pain, fibromyalgia, cluster headaches, and even phantom limb pain. And what's interesting is so many different research institutions and corporations are exploring this question. It's not exactly a fringe topic. I recently reported on this phenomenon for Scientific American. You can find a link to read the article in the show notes. The question, whether psychedelics can really help with pain, doesn't have an answer yet, but a lot of people are asking it, and so far, the results are fascinating. What follows are 2 interviews I did for that story that did not make it into the final cut. Sometimes when reporting, I cover so much that I can't include everything, and, well, I didn't want to leave these 2 conversations out, so I'm sharing them on Narcotica, only lightly edited. They weren't originally intended for a podcast, so sorry in advance if anything sounds a little off. The first is a conversation with Greg McKee, CEO of Trip Therapeutics, a California-based startup that is exploring chronic pain relief using psilocybin and another psilocybin-based drug with an undisclosed formulation that is obliquely called TRP-8803. The company has partnered with the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin-Madison to study how these drugs might treat fibromyalgia. And Trip, spelt TRYP, has added leading psychedelic researcher Robin Carhart-Harris to its scientific advisory board, where he will play a, quote, critical role in clinical trial design. If you know the name Robin Carhart-Harris, he's a pretty big deal in psychedelic research. The second interview is with Dr. Johannes Ramaekers of Maastricht University, who says he is developing another pain study to look at psychedelics and fibromyalgia. He was a lead author of a very interesting study published in 2020 in the Journal of Psychopharmacology that found that, quote, low doses of LSD might constitute a novel pharmacological therapy. In the experiment, 24 healthy volunteers received single doses of 5, 10, and 20 micrograms of LSD, which is too low to have a full-blown trip, as well as placebo. They then held their hands under extremely cold water. The longer they held their hands under the cold water, the better they were determined to be able to handle their pain. This is called a cold pressor test, and it's actually a pretty common way to measure pain, which is harder than you might think. Pain is a sort of abstract, subjective experience, and pain tolerance under LSD in this study was comparable to similar studies using oxycodone or morphine, which is a pretty big deal. This is some of the best data we have on the topic so far. But before we get to those two conversations, here's our one and only advertisement from Narcotica. We are an independent program that relies on listener support via Patreon, so if you want to join more than 60 people who make this show possible, please go to patreon.com/narcotica. We have some perks like stickers, and we'll give folks a shout out on the show if you request. More stuff is coming soon, we promise. To help keep us independent, some podcasts have ads at the beginning that seriously last 10 minutes. I feel like I'm skipping fast forward so much it's going to break my fucking thumb. We don't want to turn this into a place for car insurance and diet pills, so we just want to keep bringing you free, accurate, compassionate drug policy reporting. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. We're most active on Twitter, but we're out there. Rate us, follow us, share us. It really does help us out. And anyway, this is super boring, I know, but it matters. So now that we're done with that, on to the show. Here's my conversation with Greg McKee, the CEO of Trip Therapeutics. Let's just start with a little bit of bio or a background on you. I kind of want to know yours. I can read about it online, but it's best to get it in your own words. How did you kind of enter into this space?
Yeah, that's probably a more relevant question, right? Happy to walk through my background. I tell you what happened for me was that I was working on a project here. I lived down in Southern California, in La Jolla, just outside of San Diego, or in San Diego, technically, I guess. So down here, right? So there's a whole bunch of there's a large service community, right? A whole lot of men and women who are in the armed services, right? And I was working with a group of, well, they're all men, right? Because the only men are in the Navy SEALs right now, but a bunch of former Navy SEALs and I were working on a project together. And unrelated to that, we were hanging out, right? Having beers at night and lunches and stuff like that. And, over the course of several months I was working with them, it came out that most of them had PTSD and depression. And then it further, they really started to open up about what they were doing about it. And several of them had used 5-MeO DMT to treat their PTSD, right?
Interesting.
I was thinking to myself, 5-MeO, what? I mean, never heard of it, right? And they were going to Berkeley and they were going to New Mexico, and it was all, it wasn't prescribed medication. They were going to some, back alley or something. It wasn't really quite clear how they were getting access, but they were getting access. And the main point was that they were just all over the top of what it had done for them. They had tried everything up to this point, and nothing worked. So that was my introduction, frankly. And I just was thinking to myself, wow, this is actually pretty interesting that there's chemistry around that no one is really developing in the pharmaceutical industry, which is most of my background, which I'll get into in a minute. But there's a whole bunch of people who I respect or are super intelligent, and these guys are swearing by it. So that was my introduction. Founder, who's a really good friend of mine, Bill Garner, put a trip together a couple of years ago. He and I would typically meet at JP Morgan every year, and we've done that for 20 years. And he and I bumped into each other at the end of last year. He mentioned this company Trip that he was working on, and he was looking to expand the board. And I said, yeah, fantastic. I'd love to, because I was really interested about getting involved in chemistries that had so much history, right? Just knowing how long it takes to get through the FDA and so forth. All that history, the safety databases and all that around this chemistry really allow it to move very quickly into clinical development. And you skip a lot of the preclinical stages, a lot of the characterization, trying to figure out, all sorts of things related to manufacturing, although there are a couple of interesting manufacturing challenges we're going through. So, I was pretty excited about the idea of getting involved in the chemistry that I had seen firsthand through these good friends at Navy SEALs that really seemed to have activity and work. And then two, I realized there's all this history, large data sets of safety and also efficacy data in a whole bunch of different academic trials, all of which you've studied, right? Like at Yale and NYU and Hopkins and other places, right? And then I realized that this is sort of the time, and then in talking to Trip a little bit and the rest of the board and the co-founder, that there's just a lot of capital around right now, a lot of interest, especially up in the Canadian market, to put capital to work behind these types of companies. So all that seemed to be signaling to me that great chemistry, lots of good history and interest in capital markets to support these companies. So all that just sort of became a big green light for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering this for so long. I remember there was like barely any news about this stuff. Like you'd see a study come out once a week or something. And now it's like, it's a full-time job keeping up with all the changes going on, all the exciting research is coming out, all these companies coming up on the stock market, et cetera. I'm curious though, what motivates you to look into pain specifically as a condition that you want to treat with these compounds?
Yeah, it's a number of different reasons, right? So, one of the first, well, I don't know if it's the first or second, but one for sure is like we want to do something different, right? There are so many companies working in depression, PTSD, and anxiety, right? And we just felt like we can't be the 30th player or 40th player in that space. Like they got that covered pretty well, right? And so we're rooting on the sidelines for everyone to be successful, like for sure, like especially. Compass's phase 2B data, right, that they should be announcing sometime this fall, right? They announced completion of recruitment in the summer. That's really critical. 230 patients. It's a huge trial. Like we hope that and expect that will be positive. But we didn't want to be another company. It just seemed like that's covered already, right? And then the second thing, which is probably even more valid, is that as we started doing our own research into the field and started working with a number of different academic collaborators, including Robin Carhart-Harris, who actually I was just on the phone with this morning, who's moving over to UC San Francisco, which is awesome. He's already started there technically as of July 1st. Talking to Dan Claw, who just recently added to our SAB, who's at the University of Michigan. Dan in particular was a big lead for us. It became apparent that there was huge unmet need in a very specific category of pain known as nociplastic pain. And that's essentially what's now is being viewed as kind of the third category of pain. There's obviously nociceptive pain, which is ongoing inflammation and damage to tissues. There's neuropathic pain, which is caused by nerve damage, right? And then there's this third category, which is believed to be all CNS driven, right? So it's all driven by the central nervous system, right? So there's a whole bunch of different subcategories, which we can get into in a minute. But Dan is one of the world leading experts in the study of fibromyalgia. He's been involved in the development of all three compounds that have been approved for that specific indication, right? And when you hear him talk about the efficacy of those compounds and the side effects, it turns out, for example, that 30% of the patients taking these drugs end up getting addicted to opioids because they drop off therapy. 90% of people drop off therapy after 1 year, which is really horrible, right? And the percent efficacy rates are incredibly low. So even though Dan and his team, Kevin Banke and a bunch of other people at the University of Michigan have been working in these fields, or that field in particular, they're saying, look, like we haven't solved the problem at all. We're just scratching the surface with these three drugs that are currently approved: Lyrica, Cymbalta, and Savella. And then as they've been doing research, Dan's looked at cannabinoids. He's looked at some other treatment paradigms. And over the years, he's kind of come to the conclusion that it's all, something's going on with the brain. I don't know if you heard this yet in your kind of research, but one of the ways we're hearing described a lot is that the brain is sort of stuck in a certain pattern, right? And it just needs to quote unquote get unstuck, which isn't really a technical term, but I've heard it kicked around a few times. But that's kind of the view that you need to use some sort of chemistry that can unlock the neuroplasticity of the brain and help it get unstuck from learned patterns that it just repeats over and over, which aren't helpful in these particular cases, right? And so he's got a huge publication on nociplastic pain, which I'd be happy to send to you. And they don't really think that there's been much else they've tried in the cannabinoid space that works, and they think that there's a pretty strong, not only big opportunity, but strong rationale that something like a psychedelic like psilocybin, which is what we're working on, coupled with psychotherapy, could be enough to really just like move patients out of that mindset that they're currently in and get them retrained in a way to effectively have a different relationship with their pain and then resolve that problem. So mechanistically, right, like everything and this is a big discussion we were having this morning with Robin and one of his colleagues at Imperial College, was like the areas of their interest, and everything revolves around that same mechanistic approach, that somehow the brain is stuck, and it can be an addictive behavior. It can be an eating disorder. It can be, a pain signal. It can be depression. Obviously, there's a lot of different mood disorders. There's a lot of different things, but there's definitely a common thread. It can be, we had a long conversation about obesity. For example, there's all the stats on how people will take weight loss drugs, and then as soon as they get off the drugs, or even if they get to kind of a maintenance dose, the weight doesn't stay off because they just can't, they don't mentally get in the right state of having the right relationship with weight in their body, and they just start eating, again, right? It's a mental thing. It's not just a physical, there's a huge mental element in any case.
Yeah. And
right?
I want to talk to you also about, your eating disorder study, but to back up to pain a little bit, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about how you envision this being administered, because you talked a little bit about psychotherapy.
Yes.
But, are we even talking a micro dose versus a macro dose? Is this sort of a long-term thing, or is this like you take it?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me mention a couple of things, right? So
Sure.
in chronic pain, nociplastic pain, there's a massive field, right, in terms of the different subcategories. So fibromyalgia is one. We're looking at that. We're looking at, phantom limb pain is probably the easiest one you can wrap your head around. At least for me, that was the case, right? Which is individuals had an amputation. There's no nerve damage, right? So they clearly don't have neuropathic pain. There's no inflammation because there's no limb there, right? So they don't have nociceptive pain, but they've got pain in their limb, right? They've got these shooting pains and burning sensations in their arm or leg that's been amputated, right? So it's obviously, it's purely mental. So phantom limb pain is another one. We're looking at what's known as complex regional pain syndrome, which is sort of akin to fibromyalgia, but typically it's caused by a surgical intervention or some other, injury often, but it ends up being just sort of this ongoing pain. There's probably a list of 7 or 8 different subcategories of nociplastic or chronic pain: TMJ, vertigo, spasticity, spinal cord injuries, functional abdominal pain. IBS has also been implicated, irritable bowel syndrome, right? So a bunch of different subcategories. And then in terms of delivery, so really interesting when you dive into it, right? So for sure, like a lot of companies, we're thinking about coupling the therapeutic element, right? Therapeutic drug plus psychotherapy, right? And there's a bunch of interesting nuances in the psychotherapy. So there's pre-treatment to essentially get patients ready for the experience. There's monitoring when they're being dosed drug. And then there's what are called integration sessions afterwards, where the brain essentially, gets retrained. And just as a side note, I've had a bunch of conversations with psychotherapists, and they're really frustrated on just how darn long it takes for them to be effective with patients, right? Like their quote unquote talk therapy, as a lot of them like to characterize it, it just takes too long. It takes too many sessions. So they're kind of itching. At least I'm beginning to come to the conclusion that they're chomping at the bit to find some way to get their patients' brains a little bit more malleable and receptive to their psychotherapy, right? So there'll be psychotherapy. We are specifically going to come up with a regimen that's a little bit unique on an indication basis, meaning, the patients in eating disorders are going to be treated slightly different than the patients with fibromyalgia in that, their conditions a little bit different, and what the patient has got the challenging relationship with is unique. So how the psychotherapist, kind of pre-treats them and how they monitor probably is similar, but what they do in the integration sessions will be slightly different. We just completed our first train sessions of a dozen psychotherapists a few weeks back at the University of Florida for our eating disorders trial. So there's a very unique psychotherapy manual, as we're calling it, for each one of these studies. Our drug for these studies right now is an off-the-shelf oral tablet, 25 milligram. In most of the studies, we're using a weight-based dosing in our eating disorders study, since the patients are a little bit heavier. Then that's essentially just to answer it's an exploratory study to answer the basic question: does psilocybin work in these therapeutic areas? And then answer a bunch of ancillary questions, exploratory questions around secondary endpoints. There's a whole bunch of other questionnaires that we're raising to the surface. There's a couple of different biomarkers that we're looking at. We're looking at functional MRI. We're looking at EEG. And we're trying to get a better sense of what's actually happening to the brain. And we're correlating certain brain activity with dosing. We're also correlating that to blood levels. as well, just to get a baseline. So that's what we're doing in the 2 ways. But in parallel, we are working on a novel formulation that will use a novel route of administration. So right now we see a couple of the big problems being that one, when people go on a trip, it's highly inconsistent. So, and it can sometimes not happen at all, or it'll last for like 10 or 12 hours, which is really a problem, right? Like to have a psychotherapist, right? Like who wants this? Like you can't schedule around that. And the psychotherapist, can't trash an entire day. When it can probably be dealt with in a much more tight time frame. The second thing is that if patients have a bad trip, there's not much to do. You can give them an antidote, but it's a little questionable. You're giving them a second drug. There can be reactions to that and so forth. So we're not microdosing. Although I was also talking to Robin and his colleague David Erzoy about that again today because I was kind of curious. They're doing a little bit of a study. But our view is that microdosing doesn't work. And right now the data doesn't support that. But look, if someone figures out how to make microdosing work, then God bless them. And like, we're all for that, right? Like, fantastic. But our view right now is that you're going to need to get dosed with a pretty, I don't know if I'd call it a high dose, but a pretty significant dose of drug. And you can imagine, right, Troy, that you can, we typically, pharma industry serves up drugs in pill form typically, but biologics, are sometimes injected, vaccines are injected, of course, intramuscularly or subcutaneously. You can, of all the buccal formulations, the either in the side of the lip or under the tongue, sublingual formulations. IV, of course, is another way to, get drugs to the body. There's the nasal inhalation. There's just full on, drugs that hit the lung directly. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can deliver drugs to the human body. We just think that out of that, and sorry, they got to be so cryptic, but we still need to generate some data to secure our IP position. But we think that of that kind of set of different ways, so all the way from microdosing to, from tablets to IV to buccal to sub-Q, IM, nasal, and then just inhalation in general, that out of that, there's a couple different ways that are really interesting in that they can likely, create a much more consistent experience. And there can be mechanisms to shut down the experience in a lot shorter period of time, which would give it a better safety profile. So we're looking at one of those routes in particular as our primary, modality. We've got a unique formulation around that's nearly completed. We've got a partnership with the University of Michigan and also University of another institution in the Midwest that's going to do some preliminary studies for us. And then we've got some bridging studies that we'll formally put together in the next 9 months that will allow us to go into phase 2B studies with that unique formulation. But it's closely aligned to psilocybin. It's right in that family, but a little bit unique chemistry and a very unique formulation and a unique route of administration. So our ultimate product is going to be the combination of drug plus psychotherapy, but the drug will be in a unique format.
Okay,
sorry,
cool.
It's a bit of an earful. Yeah, that's quite a bit, but sorry about that. Yeah.
No, that's great. I mean, that answers so many of my questions. And I know you can't really talk about what the chemical is specifically. I think we're speaking about TRP 8802.
Yeah, let me clarify. So 8802, and happy to also send you our deck. You can grab it off our website, but I can also email it to you. There's also a really good article that we'll get across to you that Joel Castellano from UC San Diego wrote on a list of studies. He did a nice little survey in terms of studies that were done in the past around chronic pain, right? So there's most of them are in phantom limb, which is kind of an area of their expertise at UCSD. There's a couple studies that were done by this guy by the name of Kutch back in like 67 and a group, Cast and Collins in 64. They were actually looking at cancer and ischemic and neuropathic pain. And then cluster headaches. There was a series of studies like in 2010, 2006, 2015. I'll send this to you so you can kind of look at this table. But there's a handful of studies essentially in phantom limb, in cancer pain, and cluster headaches. Call it those three areas, which he kind of calls the baseline, and there were some in LSD. There were a lot in LSD, some in psilocybin. Basically, those two chemistries. There's one slightly different variant of LSD, 2-bromo LSD, but most of them are LSD. Yeah, psilocybin. So he's got a kind of a good little baseline there in terms of other historical data that's been put together in this space to show some outcomes. The 8802 is off the shelf oral psilocybin that is manufactured by USONA Foundation that we and a whole bunch of academics are using to run these early phase 2A studies. And then 8803 is our novel formulation that will be used in our novel route of administration. So that's what that is. That's the difference between those two.
Okay.
We may begin to create some other labels depending on what happens with our formulation on 8803, but right now there's just the two. 8802 is to get us going in clinic. 8803 is our proprietary, version of psilocybin.
Okay. Yeah. USON is great. So you can't really tell me, if it's like the specific chemical that 8803 is. Are you worried about patents or anything like that? I know there's the patent space in psychedelics is, it's heating up a lot. People are, staking out territory more and more, and it's really interesting to watch.
Yeah. It's a great space to keep an eye on, right? And like, love to, like, whatever you write on this, I want to like know about it. Like whatever you find out would be super helpful. We feel really comfortable about what's happening and not too concerned about what other people, have. We've hired Morrison Forster as our IP counsel. Jim Mullen, who heads up IP work for them, who's based down here in Southern California, who leads their practice, is our head IP guy. We've got a couple other people in the shop, one up in the Bay Area that we're working with, and also some other outside counsel that we're working with on the whole IP portfolio. We actually, a couple of weeks back, did a full run through of Compass's, for patents. And look, nothing against Compass, right? Like we want them to be really successful. We know that they're kind of the leader in the field right now with their 4 patents that have been issued. But if you look at those patents, 3 of the 4 of them are very niche-y, very focused patents on their specific formulation. So they've effectively patented their formulation, and there's like no blocking patent whatsoever, right? Their patent is very specific around the purity, around their manufacturing process, and things as tightly defined as the refraction parameters of the chemistry, right? Which is a typical way that you kind of look at how the salts and chloroformers wrap around a chemistry. Is you shine light on it and it bounces off in certain angles, and that's sort of one of the ways that you determine that molecule is unique, right? It's essentially like saying, like, I patented a chair, right? And it happens to be a 5-leg chair, and it's got a certain type of cushion, a certain type of back, and it's unique for sure, but like it's a chair, right? And you can get around that if you have a 4-legged chair or a 3-legged, chair, right? It's the kind of that level of patenting, which again, no knock on them, right? They're doing everything they can to protect their chemistry, their molecule, and they're doing a great job on all that. But like, it's not blocking at all. So no, we're not worried. We've already filed one provisional back in March of 2021. We've got another provisional that we're going to be filing in the next couple of months. And then we've got a very specific process in place and set of steps that we've lined up to convert both those provisional patents into PCT filings in the coming 6 to 12 months, right? You've got obviously 12 months to convert provisional patents to PCT filings, right? Otherwise you lose those priority dates on the provisional patents. So we're, lining up our experiments in a way that we can generate the right kind of data. And we're going broad, around the therapeutic areas that we're looking at. We're going broad around our particular, formulation. One of the things that, we're looking at is that, delivery is really important. I don't know if this is a little side note, but I don't know if I just learned over the weekend that there's only one lipid difference between the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. I didn't realize that was like that little of a difference between those two vaccines. They're both mRNA, right? They're essentially the reason that vaccine works, the COVID vaccine works, is that they had to encapsulate it in the right set of lipids to essentially keep the body from destroying the DNA construct, the mRNA construct, because it's just like so fragile. And they use 4 lipids. And the only difference is one of those 4 lipids. And it's like, wow, like That was really surprising to me, especially given like I have a whole bunch of friends in the healthcare system that all got the Pfizer vaccine and they all got sick on their second dose. I had the Moderna and all my friends got Moderna and none of us had any problem. Right. And it was like, so these little nuances make a big difference. So the delivery of psilocybin we think it's really interesting. And we know that, and it's well known that there's, that it's a prodrug and there's a lot of other elements, to it. So we think there's a lot to be done around that particular chemistry as well as how it gets formulated. So I can say that much. And on top of that, then the route of administration. And I can also say that stability of the specific derivative that we're looking at is also historically been a challenge, but we've navigated around that. So we're pretty excited about that as well.
Yeah, this is all really interesting because there are so many tiny nuances to this biochemistry stuff, which...
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the classic examples is S-ketamine, with Johnson & Johnson. And there's a lot of debate over that. I'm not an expert. I can't really say which way it is. If S-ketamine is better than racemic ketamine or R-ketamine, So, I mean, I guess that's my question is, whatever your compound 8803 is, like, let's say it's 4-ACO-DMT, it's a different prodrug that breaks down into psilocin. What makes you think it would be more effective for pain? Is there something there or are you just trying to figure that out still?
Yeah, I mean, I asked this question a lot, right? Like, I asked David Aratoy today, Robin's colleague at Imperial, and Robin was on the call. It's like, guys, like, help me out again. Like, I know I've asked this a bunch of times. I ask everybody in the field, like, what's the difference between LSD, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, like S-ketamine, like you're saying, right? And like all this stuff. I think that right now, like, nobody really knows. I think is the bottom line. It's like there's just not. I mean, nobody, Troy, can say to any of us definitively that they know because no one's done the head-to-head studies in these indications. I think it'll probably get teased out over time, and my sense is that in some way it may not exactly matter. I think that there's a whole bunch of work that's going to get done in a bunch of different chemistries. Everyone's going to sort of say they think they've got the answer. Everyone's going to try. And then if it works, they're going to start moving ahead. And then I think the market's going to probably kind of lose track in terms of, why that chemistry, why LSD versus psilocybin or psilocin or, whatever. And I think that over time, then maybe there'll be some other nuances that get sort of teased out, but nobody's like running experiments right now that are going to give us the right answer of like why. We are looking at psilocybin because, frankly, the history, and because a lot of the academics that we're working with, at the University of Florida, University of Michigan, Imperial College, two other academic institutions that we can't quite name yet, but they're both here in California and they're both part of the UC system, right? Like all these institutions, like they just have so much more, some of them are using other chemistries for sure, but they have so much more history and there's just been so much more work around psilocybin. And so that's kind of where it's most of the work seems to be being done for right now, for better or worse. So we don't really have an answer in terms of like why we think psilocybin would work better in pain versus some other psychedelic. We don't know yet. We do know that there's the most history on psilocybin, which gives us the most comfort going into humans. And we know there's a rationale to use a psychedelic for this particular type of pain called nociplastic pain.
And, the other thing you're treating is, or attempting to study is treating fibromyalgia. And, I kind of expressed already my editor's concerns about this, because I guess fibromyalgia is kind of like a controversial thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I saw those questions. Yeah, no, fair enough. It certainly has been controversial, right? I would say it's less controversial now, in part because physicians feel like they've got a couple of different tools in their arsenal they can use, right? I mean, they've got these 3 drugs that they can prescribe to patients: Lyrica, Cymbalta, Savella, right? There's been, there's been now decades of work in this space. I think that physicians, now feel like it used to be sort of this catch-all type of disease, category when patients, didn't fit into any other box. They kind of got, dropped in the fibromyalgia box. But I think that now more that indication is got some legitimacy, and they've got tools to treat it. I think so. Both those things kind of help that out quite a bit. But I also think that when you talk to the experts, and we're not experts in fibromyalgia quite yet, but we're working really closely with Kevin Benke, who I mentioned before, who's at the University of Michigan, right? He'll be the PI on our study. And he's working directly with Dan Claw. Dan is like the head honcho kind of in that shop. And we've got a great body of psychotherapists, these researchers, plus anesthesiologists and other people from the University of Michigan. They feel like there's so much, like we haven't solved the problem. Like all three of these drugs really don't solve the problem. And they feel like there's a high chance that a psychedelic should really, help get the brain rewired of these patients and be effective. So I would say that stigma that was sort of around fibro has really dissipated quite a bit, at least, because that was kind of my understanding when I, first kind of showed up here at the company about 8 months ago. I was a little bit concerned about that. It also has kind of squishy endpoints, right? As well. There's high placebo rates. Dan will talk about, he's mentioned that several times in our conversations. But I think that the medical community has kind of moved beyond that. And I've got a number of friends who are physicians, and I've talked to them and, casually, mentioned that we're looking at this space, and all of them are just like, yeah, please, like do something. Like they're really frustrated. They can't find a way to solve the problem of these patients. But I feel like that stigma is, at least in the medical community, has kind of like gone away. And now like physicians have begun to really, they've either been forced to address it, or they now at least have some tools to slightly address it, right? And it's sort of become a little bit more mainstream. It's a massive indication. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of patients that show up in the clinic and are diagnosed with this that need to be treated. So it seems like it's a big problem. But yeah, no, I hear I hear that, but I think that maybe the markets, or at least the medical community, has moved on. I don't know if the general public has.
And that's why you think, is it still 8803, or is there a different compound you're trying to treat fibromyalgia with?
Yeah, so it'll be the same in both cases. So fibro is just, we kind of view that as one of the subcategories within chronic pain or nociplastic pain. It's going to be one of the first three, right? Fibromyalgia, phantom limb, and complex regional pain syndrome will be our first three in that particular category. Okay, and it seems like you're really banking on this theory that this sort of pain has a lot to do with mental connections in the brain. So, I mean, yes, what kind of evidence do you have for that, or are you still trying to figure that out? There's a good yeah, no, we actually feel like there's a pretty good basis for that. I'll make sure that one of the other things that we sent across to you is this article that Dan Claw wrote on this new they've been trying to figure out in the pain space for a long time what to kind of name this category of pain, but I think they've all kind of come to conclusion to call it nociplastic pain. At least that's the current thinking. And there's just a really good kind of general outline in terms of like why they think that's the case. But there's been many different subcategories of nociplastic pain or chronic pain that have emerged that clearly don't have some sort of inflammation or some sort of nerve damage as being the primary source of the pain, right? Like there's just, in the first two cases, the physician can identify a certain pain and patients will respond to the pain. There's quite a few drugs that attack and that can deal with neuropathic pain, and they can deal with nociceptive pain. But there's nothing right now that can deal with nociplastic pain, right? Where there's chronic, pain that's related to the central nervous system. And so all these diseases kind of fall under that same umbrella.
Yeah. And then the last question is about timeline. That's hard to answer, I know, but when do you think some of these results will come out, or any of that kind of thing? Approval, I know that's pretty far away. And I think it's actually, just kind of smart what you're doing. Like you're already taking on drugs that have a lot of established safety profiles, so you can go right into phase 2. That's same with Razozane, which is a cool name for a drug. So can you talk to me a little bit about the timeline, even though I know that's hard to estimate?
Yeah. So we're doing a lot of work on that internally. The first milestones, kind of first timeline, is getting us into the clinic. So we've got these first two indications for binge eating disorder and hypothalamic obesity. So that's in the category of the eating disorders bucket. The University of Florida, we anticipate filing our IND sometime actually in the next couple of weeks. USONA just got back to us. They've had to file an amendment to their IND on a new manufacturer. They've got a new manufacturer that's it's Lonza. I think it's probably not a secret. They're manufacturing. They have a new site here in the United States, or a site in the United States that they just got qualified that USONA is using to manufacture API, which is great. Lonza is like a legitimate CMO that's been around forever in the pharma space. So they had to file an amendment with the FDA on those changes, and they're clicking through the 30-day review window right now. And as soon as that's completed, which will be done this week, then we'll be in a position to file our IND for the University of Florida. So that's like just about ready to hit the go button on that to file the IND. Similar with University of Michigan, we've been in deep conversations with their team, with Kevin Banke and Dan Claw now for months around that particular protocol and all the pieces that go into play for that study, including the psychotherapy manual, the investigative brochure, the informed consent, the imaging manual, and other things. And we hope to file that probably in the next 30 to 60 days. And then in both cases, be ready to start dosing patients shortly thereafter. So those two are on the cusp of getting going. We've got two other studies that I mentioned, one with the UC institution in Northern California, one with the UC institution in Southern California, looking at complex regional pain syndrome and phantom limb pain. The phantom limb pain study, assuming we get that collaboration put together, they've actually already filed the IND. We'll be making an amendment to upsize that trial to double the numbers of patients and add a placebo arm to make it a really robust trial so that they can get a significant publication and we get more data. So if we get that pulled off, we'll be essentially, making a simple IND amendment and in the clinic in the next 30 to 60 days in that indication. The complex regional pain syndrome will take a little bit longer as we're just starting those conversations now in that clinical trial design. But the first three will get going probably in the fall. And then data from those, they're, except for the phantom limb study, which is a controlled trial, the others are open label. So we'll be getting data kind of on a patient by patient basis. We probably won't be announcing, one patient at a time, but probably every, once we have three, they're not cohorts necessarily, but once we have, say, 3 or 4 patients each, from each one of these trials, we'll probably make some sort of announcement about that, I would guess. So we'll be able to do that on a kind of open label basis. The phantom limb study has an interim analysis that we're just determining the timing on that. That probably is going to be 9 months out from the start. So sometime, third quarter or so next year. So, but generally, like timing for data for 8802, we should have, in 6 to 12 months from now. And then we anticipate initiating our phase 2B studies with TRIP 8803 sometime in the third quarter of next year. Those trials will probably take us a couple of years to generate data out of.
Thank you. That answered my question. That's all my questions. Is there anything else on this topic that you want people to know about? Anything we might have missed in this conversation, or anything that you wish I'd asked you about?
I think that's actually really pretty good. I mean, the other thing I think I've just you're asking around a little bit, but we're also pretty intrigued with eating disorders.
Yeah.
Right. And there's, and I think that frankly, we haven't quite got to the point where we're sort of carving out obesity, but I think that as we were sort of saying at the top of the conversation, I feel like there's a huge opportunity for us to kind of lean into that particular space. We're looking at a couple of niche type areas called hypothalamic obesity, where there's damage to the hypothalamus, typically because of removal of a brain tumor that then leads to this eating misbehavior, I'll call it. Binge eating is kind of, definitely more on the addictive side. And then we're also looking at Prader-Willi syndrome, which is genetically initiated, but ends up then being this, kind of stuck brain problem where kids just aren't eating properly. But each one of those, I think, potentially could lead to this notion of trying to help patients like rethink their relationship with food in a more appropriate way. And I feel like there's just a massive opportunity there that nobody is really, kind of quite tapped into, yet. But we're pretty excited about, that. possibility. And our first foray will be with the University of Florida in these two different areas. So I think that's the other thing I would just kind of underscore. And then, yeah, I mean, that's kind of it. I mean, otherwise, our approach, like everybody in the team has a deep, background in drug development. Just to kind of full circle, to close out with my background a little bit. I've been working in the biotech industry since '96, so like forever, I don't know how many years, 25 years. My first company was Genzyme out in Boston, a big successful company that got sold to Sanofi for about $22 billion, had a marketed drug that I worked on, launching that in Asia. It was orphan, they had created on its own. And I worked in two different other areas, in early new areas of research. Gene therapy and immunotherapy were the two areas. Primarily, I was working in cancer and cardiovascular disease. So I always, worked in spaces where there can be just like a big push forward in terms of our knowledge, and also in terms of like benefit to patients. So that's a really big driver for me, is just like, we got to be in a space where we can really help out people in a significant way. So like the whole team is that way. Our whole focus is on kind of a more traditional ethical pharmaceutical drug development pathway for these chemistries. We know that set and setting is really important, right? Like, as I'm sure you picked up on, and we know the psychotherapy piece is critical, but we're looking at this as like the whole path to really provide access to patients is not on the recreational side, but it's all, through the FDA. And we think then that this can really unleash the total potential. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I'm excited. I think it's a really cool field. I think it's going to add a lot to the healthcare space.
There's definitely a need for stuff like this. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate if you send over that pain study and the deck and the thing that Dan Claw wrote. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot. Good luck, man.
Bye.
That was an interview with Greg McKee, CEO of Trip Therapeutics. Now here's a discussion I had with Dr. Johannes Ramaekers of Maastricht University. Thanks for listening.
Great. I read about you before. I've read some of your research before, but maybe we could just start with a little bit of your bio, your background, in your own words, just for accuracy's sake.
Yeah. So I work as a professor in psychopharmacology at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And we have a long tradition of studying the impact of medicinal drugs, but also drugs of abuse on human functions, to put it in the broadest context. And more recently, we have been focusing a bit more on psychedelic compounds. And that we started about 20 years ago with our first controlled studies with MDMA, for example, which is not psychedelic, but it's within the same realm. But our expertise is basically on control studies, or placebo-controlled studies that are being conducted in our laboratory, in which usually healthy volunteers, but sometimes also patients, are invited to take a dose or repeated doses of a compound. And then, depending on the research question, we would look at, for example, human cognition. How does it change under the influence of, or mood? In the case of this study that you're particularly interested in, one of the prime interests was pain, the analgesic effects of psychedelics. And the big advantage of setups like that is that you are in control. It's a placebo-controlled. You can actually keep the circumstances and the environment in which a drug is being taken constant across treatment conditions, where the only thing that varies basically is the drug. So any change that you see in these within subject designs, as we call them, are always related to the compound that somebody took relative to his or her performance, doing the same task in the same environment, but during the placebo condition. So it's a very strong design, basically, for which you only need relatively few participants, to have like sufficient statistical power to detect even small differences that are being induced by a compound. So I think that is our core approach for studying the impact of compounds on human cognition primarily. But we've also done some naturalistic observational studies, which is great, particularly with some compounds that are less known. I mean, I think you spoke to Marlene Oethaug like last year or 2 years ago, when we published our paper on the toad venom, 5-MeO-DMT. That was an example of an observational study and of a compound that is not so easy to administer under controlled condition in a laboratory. At least back then. Now that has changed, but back then it was simply not available in the quality that would be requested by an IRB to be able to actually administer it in a controlled setting. So, and when we do these studies, we basically come from three perspectives. One is to see and check whether any of these compounds are associated with adverse events that might affect your day-to-day operations. The other perspective would be, but are there, in contrast to that, are there any therapeutic benefits that you may expect from that same compound? And third is more fundamentally driven and focusing on the mechanisms, the underlying biological or neural mechanisms that can explain some of the findings that we see when we administer drugs to people, and relative to the behavior that it produces. So the interface between the pharmacology that goes into your body and the behavioral outcome of that.
Yeah, this microdosing study is so interesting because it seems like you got a really strong effect from it.
We did actually. I was surprised too because. I mean, when we found that data, I did some comparisons with other studies that use the same pain paradigm. So keeping your hand in cold water, basically, for as long as you can, which is a classic paradigm that has been applied in many other studies as well, including studies with opioids. And basically what I noticed, that if you compare the outcomes of the analgesic effects, or the effect size of the analgesic effect that we recorded, is actually comparable to some of the classic opioids that are currently being used to treat pain, right? At least in healthy volunteer models, right? We did test it in a healthy volunteer model. So I compared our effect size to the effect size of opioids in healthy volunteers.
Yeah, I'm curious how this research would translate to people with different types of pain.
I mean, so I'm curious too. So we are currently working on a follow-up, and of course, it's nice. It's a really nice result, but we need to demonstrate that this actually generalizes to patient populations. And so we're now working on a protocol on that we will submit soon, and the idea would be to basically replicate this study, but in patients that are suffering from fibromyalgia, so a neuropathic pain that it's a pretty common disorder, but there's not really a dedicated treatment for it.
Yeah.
Opioids are being prescribed, cannabinoids are being prescribed, so we are very interested to see how a psychedelic would actually fare with those patients.
That's very interesting because part of my story I'm doing is about Trip Therapeutics. They're also doing a fibromyalgia psychedelic study.
Yeah.
You're not associated with them, right?
With Trip Therapeutics, I don't even know them, I think. Well, I'm not surprised that somebody's looking at it. I mean, there have been some interesting studies but they were conducted way back in the 60s. I'm not necessarily in pain patients, but some of those were conducted in people who were dying from cancer and suffering lots of pain. And there are some studies in which those patients were administered full doses of LSD, or really full doses, and they reported efficacy in at least a subjective experience of pain. But at the same time, there were also participants in those studies that refused the second dose because they found the entire experience way too disturbing. I think so. And the great breakthrough, maybe not, but I think that the novelty of our study is that we could actually achieve analgesic effects with low doses of LSD that, as such, do not produce a psychedelic experience. Not in a sense that you have vivid hallucinations and that would actually interfere with your day-to-day operations, right?
Right.
We administered 5 and 10 and 20 micrograms.
And the 20 was the best, right?
Yeah, and so that's really, people call this microdosing, but these are not microdoses at all. These are just low doses.
Yeah.
But 20 micrograms is really a noticeable dose in the sense that colors may look a little bit brighter, but anybody, I dare to say, that takes 20 micrograms can just operate their normal routine, right? Sit behind a computer or just have like a conversation like we have over Zoom, and you wouldn't notice it. So it is a dose that you can take safely in a normal situation, I think, and that's why, in terms of therapeutic, it might actually be interesting. Because you have the analgesic effect, but you don't have the psychedelic effects of the compound. And also, it has a very interesting pharmacokinetic profile, because LSD, when it attaches to the 5-HT2A receptor, it sticks to it for a pretty long time before it's being removed. So the entire experience of an LSD trip, can easily last 12 hours, which you don't want for this particular types of purposes. But if it's a low dose, it also lasts for 12 hours. So basically, a single administration can give you therapeutic coverage for at least half a day.
Yeah.
So it's unthinkable that if you only have like a single administration per day, right, to treat pains. And maybe, who knows, we haven't looked at that yet, but there is, of course, the whole story of neuroplasticity that is being generated by psychedelics. We don't know if that story also flies with such analgesic effects, but it cannot be excluded, and it should be studied, and it will be studied at some point, whether some of these acute effects that we see actually linger on over time, even when people are not dosing themselves with a low dose.
Yeah. So I spoke to Trip Therapeutics, and they're actually trying psilocybin, or a derivative of psilocybin, for fibromyalgia. So maybe it's different, but their CEO told me that in their experience, the microdosing isn't as effective. So maybe, I don't know if a macrodose is better. I want to talk to you about whether you can remove the hallucinogenic effects of the compound, and that would maybe still work.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Do you think microdosing or macrodosing, is there a better route there? Or
so I don't know why the spokesperson of Trip Therapeutics thinks that a full dose is more effective than a low. I haven't seen the data for that, but maybe he has some data that he hasn't shared with others. But I think to give a full dose of psilocybin or LSD, if it's a single time administration, as in the treatment of depression, or repeated administrations, that actually means that somebody has to come back to go to the hospital, basically to get a prescription under supervision of a medical doctor. It's not like you have a strip of psychedelics, take them home. And so that's not going to happen. So it's really related then to clinics. And that, of course, is a big problem. So if you had a compound that does not that does the same, that has the analgesic effect, but doesn't produce the hallucinations, then I think that could be very profitable for the prescriber, but also for the patients.
Yeah.
And then there are people actually looking at that same idea, right? Because there is a discussion ongoing in the entire research community that the psychedelic experience itself actually contributes to the therapeutic benefit. But this is particularly in the context of treating a depression or treating a post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the context of neurological pains, I would think that the psychedelic experience as such, right, is not really needed. And in a way superfluent. So I think if you could develop a compound that is a 5-HT2 agonist, but that doesn't have the psychedelic properties as such, then I think that would be a very interesting route.
So what is the importance of 5-HT1A receptor antagonism here?
Yeah.
That was something that was in your paper and that's really interesting. I mean, I know a lot about 2A agonism, but not much.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question, and I don't think I have the full answer to that either. But we do. Most of the psychedelics are agonists of 5-HT2, but also 5-HT1A, but they may actually differ quite a lot. In this case, it is relevant that both of those receptors, and they are both being triggered by LSD, are located in descending pathways, serotonergic pathways that descend from the radial nucleus to the spinal cord. So they are actually involved in the processing of pain, and stimulation of that sort of inhibits that signaling of pain in your body. So and that's why you don't feel it. And that whether it's 5-HT1 or 2, which contributes the most, I wouldn't know.
Okay.
I think that in order to find out, you would need to do mechanistic studies in which you first block 5-HT1A and then administer LSD, and in the next condition you would do a blockade of 5-HT2 and then administer LSD, and so on and so on. Then you could actually address that question, but that hasn't been done yet, as far as I know.
Are you familiar with Project Angie from MindMed?
Yeah, Matthias Lichty.
Yeah, he's associated with MindMed, and also MindMed's also searching or exploring using psychedelics for pain. But do you have any thoughts on their project?
I think that they are looking at psilocybin or LSD. I'm not sure.
LSD, I think.
Okay,
I'd have to double check, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, MindMed is doing so many studies with Matthias Lichty that I'm losing track of it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because I know they're doing studies with psilocybin and Parkinson patients and ADHD. They're looking at mescaline, a whole lot of things. So I don't know exactly what the setup is actually in their study. Maybe you can summarize it for me, and I can comment.
I'm not really sure on all the details. Like you said, he's good for Lichty. He's getting a lot of work from MindMed. But
I think he must have shares with MindMed, because actually, I mean, he told me that he's completely booked for the next, 5 years or so.
Yeah.
Because of those studies that he's doing with MindMed. But I mean, Matthias, is a very good researcher and good lab, but he does a lot of the, let's say, phase 1 work, where first you look at safety, but also at pharmacokinetics. So basically, what does your body do to the drug once it enters, and how quickly is it absorbed, and how is it metabolized and eliminated, and so on. So I think that's where they start with all of these formulations, because MindMed is, they're interested in the drug, but they need to produce their own formulation that they want to give in these, administer in these studies, because it's the formulation that they probably will patent. They can't patent LSD anymore.
Yeah.
And they can't even patent the I think the indication for pain, because that has been described already 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But even that is not novel. So it's a little bit comparable to compounds that are working on psilocybin and depression, right? And they are, most of the patent is also directed towards the formulation of psilocybin that they have produced and that making available to the clinics.
Do you foresee this ever being prescribed for pain, LSD, or?
I think, not as a first-line treatment. I don't think so.
Okay.
It is problematic in the sense that it's unlikely that even if you give a microdose, right, like 20 micrograms, it's unlikely that you would get a prescription from your general physician, for like a month. Okay, like a strip with 40 or 31 LSD doses, because then there's always the risk that somebody takes them all at once.
Yeah.
So, and that is something that I think medical people don't like at all.
Yeah.
The risk of the compound being abused in a way would be too high. So, and that means that you have to go to the clinic in order to receive the dose, and then you have to be under supervision for a while. So I don't see it right now. So I have more belief in a compound that actually needs to be developed, but there are being in the pipeline now that actually does have that analgesic effect, but not the psychedelic effect. And then you would really have like a new psychedelic analgesic. Unless we would be able to show that even if you take like a low dose or maybe even a full dose, but if you give it on a single day in the controlled environment in a medical setting, that the effects that you measure actually prolong and keep on lingering even when you after you went home, then it would become more feasible, because that's also the way psilocybin is being prescribed, right? And then I think it might become an option to actually stick to LSD or psilocybin, because then you can send people home with at least some remission for a longer time.
Yeah, I was going to ask how long you think that these effects last, if it's just, I mean, maybe that would make it LSD good for surgery or something like that, I don't know.
Well, surgery, maybe that depends on the type of surgery, I would say.
Of course.
But we did a survey recently, and we're still looking at the data that came in, but basically inquiring about subjective experiences of people all over the world with treating their pains with a psychedelic, either with a low dose or a full dose. And many of them do report that they have got symptoms that prolongs, right? That goes beyond the day of administration, depending on what pains they are experiencing. But they differ from neuropathic pains to headaches, cluster headaches. But there's quite a big group that indicates that it is effective, but also that it is effective for a longer period of time. And that is way beyond the actual day of the administration. But this is, this is anecdotal, almost subjective, so that needs to be confirmed. But then again, we have learned a lot from users in the field in terms of what the potential of psychedelics can be. So I have no a priori reason to not believe that.
Yeah. Is there a connection between the brain and physical pain that psychedelics might be able to repair, or something like that? And how much evidence is there for this?
Yeah, I mean, that I don't know. There is this neuroplasticity story.
Yeah.
That might, repair maybe some connections in these descending serotonergic pathways. But that's really just speculation on my side, and nobody has really shown this. I mean, the other explanation that has been given quite a lot, but it doesn't apply too much, I think, to low doses, is that the subjective analgesic effects are being caused by the fact that you're experiencing LSD symptoms in a way, so that the attention is kind of reallocated to I don't know, whatever it is that you see during your psychedelic experience. So if you focus on something else, then typically you would not feel your pain as much as if you were to focus on your pain, right?
Yeah,
that is a well-known mechanism, but I think, and that could be true for higher doses of a psychedelic, but it's less likely, I think, when giving low doses of LSD, because you really don't have too much of that psychedelic experience.
Yeah, so are you interested in anything like non-hallucinogenic, such as 2-bromo-LSD, or?
Yeah, I think that I'm certainly interested in that. That has been mentioned quite a lot as an interesting compound, but we haven't looked at it, but it would certainly be interesting.
I guess, yeah, what questions do you still want to answer?
Well, so first of all, I want to find out whether the effect that we found in healthy volunteers can be replicated in a patient population. So, and if you can, I mean, that clearly increases the value of a finding like that. And the second question really is on how long that effect really prevails, and how often you would need to repeat a dosing session like this in order to keep the relief of symptoms constant over time.
Yeah,
I think these are the two main questions at the moment, and that would give us some better idea on the feasibility of using these compounds, you know, in clinical practice.
And you mentioned you're going to submit a protocol soon. Do you have a timeline for that, perhaps? I know that's hard to answer, but
no, it's before the end of this year. It should be submitted and hopefully also evaluated by the IRB. So our goal is to start a study in the beginning of next year.
Okay. I guess that's it. Is there any other things on this topic that you want people to know about? Anything that we might have missed in this conversation, or you wanted me to ask you about?
Well, I think you covered most of it. So you're working on a general story, I suppose, of psychedelics? Yeah. Okay.
I'm looking at all these different companies that are exploring treating psychedelics or treating pain with psychedelics.
Yeah.
But just also the evidence. I'm going to go into the history, you know, because there's a lot of really old studies like you cited, and it's fascinating research. I think there's a lot to learn about how the brain processes pain and how that manifests.
Yeah. So that is true. So I mean, there's all of the companies that you speak to, they are. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, and not at all. But they are focusing on the clinical outcomes, right? They're interested in drug development, right? So they spend their money on showing that it is safe and efficacious in patients. But indeed, as you mentioned, there is a lack of fundamental studies that are really trying to explain and understand how psychedelics actually do interfere with the signaling and the processing of pain. Yeah, there are no studies actually at the moment. Basically also because there is a lack of funding, because these studies are expensive and they would not be funded by investors or biotech companies, because that's not their main interest. They want to focus on clinical outcomes.
What else are you working on? Do you have anything coming up or anything interesting? I really appreciate the research coming out of your university.
Yeah. So we're working on 5-MeO-DMT. We're doing control studies with 5-MeO-DMT. That could be interesting for you to report on, but that you will have to wait until next year. I think early next year or so.
Interesting.
Because we've done studies to show. So basically, that's kind of a follow-up on the toad studies that we've done. So we took it to our lab, and we did control studies in healthy volunteers, basically to see, is it safe, and what actually is the dose that you need to give somebody a full-blown psychedelic experience that people can still go through in a safe manner, right? And after that, after we had all of that information, we took that and with us and designed a study in treatment resistant, in patients with treatment resistant depression. And that is now ongoing, and I can't say anything about it right now. But next year, probably these data will be out and open. Yeah. But that would be the very first study with 5-MeO-DMT ever to look at the patient population. So that would really be interesting.
That's exciting. Send me any information you have on that when you have it. I would love to write about that. There was some news story the other day, some psychedelic company. I can email you the details because I can't remember the name. But they are making derivatives, analogs of DMT and 5-MeO-DMT.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in this space. I'm always happy to revisit it because it's...
Yeah, I think that's, there's this guy, David Olson, I think, is producing a lot of these analogs. Basically with the idea to produce a psychedelic that is efficacious in treating an indication, but does not produce that psychedelic experience as such. Yeah. So he's really trying to create psychedelics without the psychedelic effect. And he actually published a paper on that on the compound in Nature, I think like a few months ago.
Yeah, it's an ibogaine analog, I think.
Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. I'm just a journalist, not an expert. So like I have no idea if the hallucinations are really that important to the therapeutic effect of but
yeah. Well, as I said, I think it actually depends quite a lot on the indication. I don't think it's going to matter a lot for treating pain. I don't see how the psychedelic experience as such could contribute to the therapeutic effect. And also there are compounds, for example, like 5-MeO-DMT. People usually don't remember what happened.
Yeah.
So, so there's not there's not a whole lot to integrate of that actual experience if you have no memory of what happened.
The only example I can think of a type of pain that would benefit from a psychedelic experience is phantom limb pain.
Yeah,
that's an interesting one as well. But I think you're right. Yeah, and, I've talked to scientists and they're like, we've given non-hallucinogenic drugs to these rats and they show less signs of depression. It's like the rat doesn't have consciousness in the same sense as humans do, like and introspection. It can't like integrate its experience. So if it has, I don't know, it's interesting debate.
There is this great story. There's an American soldier. I forgot his name. I can find out if I want to. He got badly injured, I think, in the first Gulf War or so. And he lost 2 legs, I think, one arm and a part of this remaining arm. And he suffered from phantom pains terribly. Wow. And there was nothing that he could be cured. And nothing worked. You got whopping doses of opioids and whatever was there, and nothing worked. And he wrote a book about it. And then they gave him, as a last resort, they turned to ketamine. And they gave him doses so high that nobody, at least that people know, have ever been given to. And he I think he remained in a coma for about 3 to 4 days on ketamine.
Wow.
But it was worthwhile. So, in the sense that a lot of his pains were actually gone. Because of ketamine. And ketamine is a well-known analgesic drug, by the way. That's why what is being used. But they gave it him in such high doses that he went into a coma for days. And now he has all of these artificial limbs now, and he's like a happy dad with his family, enjoying life.
It's really interesting. That reminds me of another question I wanted to ask. If there's maybe a possibility that, LSD and psilocybin, maybe also target opioid receptors. I know salvia is a kappa opioid receptor agonist.
True. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
But I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
I mean, there may be some small affinities, but I think I don't think it's really the major route. But I don't know. So it could be, maybe. I think, but the strongest affinities really are for the serotonergic receptors and not so much for anything else.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to reading more of your research.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and Troy Farah. I'm your co-producer, Garrett Farah. Our theme music is by Glassboy, Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica, and additional music is by Robert John. You can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. These are the best ways for you to tell us that we suck. But if we don't suck, and you think we're cool, consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Narcotica. Be sure to give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, like SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, you name it. That's everything, guys. Have a nice week.